The moment is upon us. Kairos has arrived. Hello there, everybody. Today is another fantastic day, a dawning of a Trivium. As it happens to stand here today, we will be talking about a few things that I have long been cooking up, that have long been in the works, that in fact has already went from its very first draft into its current, and finally, we are looking here today at a little bit of a preview. Now, this decidedly falls under the development category, and it brings us a little bit of a look at exactly what I've been talking about over the last several streams, and for those of you who have been talking with me outside of the streams here, what the Threefold Manifold will actually look like whenever it comes to not just the stories, not just the lore, but a little bit of the things that lie underneath it, specifically the cosmology. So let's take a look at that. Here we have it. We're taking a look at the midsection. You can see over there on the right, the page 2 of 8. There is some preceding material here that does need to be reworked, but we are looking at ultimately a lot of the details of the actual way that this will be built out. Now, before we begin, we should probably talk about what all this actually is, what it all entails, and why. Let's start with that why point. On why we would begin with the cosmology, and why we would showcase that here for us all today. And I should say this will be a predominantly talking and review stream for what does exist in the document. A point for a cosmology to exist, first as the pretense for everything going forward, is so that you do not end up with any kind of plot holes, any kind of narrative disjunctions, any kind of things that don't add up. Verisimilitude is the ultimate objective, necessarily therefore. So, in the place of a sufficiency, what kind of cosmology do we want to build? Well, that can come in many answers. We can always have a number of things that could fulfill the role of a cosmology, and you can even have multiple ones going at the same time, depending on what kind of setup you're pursuing. But for us, we are in particular looking for something that will keep the experience of physical reality and the augmented and altered realities that we're looking to attain in the Threefold Manifold, where it gives you the greatest amount of laterality as well as verticality, as you should seek to befit it, along with the official playtest or playing materials that will be provided by me, and if there's any addition to the team, them as well. So, that means we need something with a lot of explanatory power, a lot of weight underneath and around it. That way, it can be expanded in any direction per the previous description. Well, the way to do that is to have something, in my opinion, that enables not only what we might in other systems more casually call magic, or the paranormal, the supernatural, all sorts of things as such, but we also want to enable it to really give a grounding and a footing for shaping reality. And that is to say, making sort of, not mythos, but a microcosmology underneath a prevailing cosmology. This is akin not so separately to the ideas as you'll see in certain settings like the Forgotten Realms, or in those like, well, I'm not an expert on it, what seems to be the explanation of Greyhawk, or Dragonlance, where they have some kind of weave, a magical substrate that supports everything on top of it and enables its various transfigurations and transmutations. So, excuse me one moment. Pardon me clearing my throat. But in this one, as opposed to something like real life as we understand our cosmology, the way that the universe is arranged, coming from, while there is some contest about what exact model and the fine details of that are carried inside of it will be the ultimate reality, whether it's quantum or classic or a sort of universal bridge between the two. The Big Bang. That's really what it amounts to for us. And all the physical phenomena that we experience out of that. Well, instead of all of that, here we have what I have dubbed, in the regard of some of the classical arts, the Panotrivium. Which brings us to our next section. And that is the gross mechanics of the Panotrivium. Insofar as this goes, that really centers around and on a, as the name describes, and I think does it very well, threefold manifold. So that is to say, a dialectic universe, in part. That is the centerpiece in something of a literal sense, not only in terms of how it all works together, but also the document itself. And if you take a look at the icon and logo for this channel and all of the branding surrounding it, you'll note at the top, as well as the bottom, in the sort of pseudo-phi, the Greek character, the two limbs that come together, come down, and then spread back out into their own bifurcation. That represents a sort of duality of dialectic in a partial sense, in that it is continuous or contingent upon the preceding elements, but not entirely directly connected to it. It is an indirect continuum, in more succinct terms, of the pre-existing dialectic that enables its existence. That is then surrounded by the individual 8 linkages of what will be represented as the surrounding content. That is, what is occurring or transpiring within that dialectic that comes away and out from it. What results from it. The accidents of it, for those of you who know much in terms of philosophical, but specifically metaphysical terms. And I do mean the more philosophical metaphysics, rather than the spiritual sort. But, to come back to it, we then are looking at, ultimately, 3 elements, and these are heavily inspired, as you might have been able to glean, by the Trivium. For those of you who are unaware, that almost directly translates to where 3 roads meet at a crossroad, or a sort of Y road in this case. And to expound on that and the idea that is nested within it, we can think of the dialectic as I was referring to earlier, that is the exchange of questioning and answering, as we'll be able to see lower down in its own section. That comes in the form of thesis, which is what a thing is, a statement in a dialogue, a premise, an argument, what have you, a judgment if you want to call it so. There are a number of names that would be appropriate for it. A antithesis, a response, an answer, maybe even what you might think of as a mirror or a resulting thesis coming in the opposite direction. And then finally, a synthesis, a bringing together of the theses into something, a progression of the thesis, and the continuity and proliferation, the propagation of that in a metaphysical context. So, having a look at that, we will take a look at the exact portions that make up the dialectices. Starting off, we have our panogrammars. For those of you who, again, are unfamiliar with the notion of the Trivium, this entails grammar, logic or dialectic, and finally rhetoric. And on those individual levels, you have different parts of reason, rationale, logic, and ultimately inference is what it comes down to. Grammar, in the first place, in the traditional sense of the scholastics or academics, is specifically what you are getting whenever you are looking at the alphabets, the basic ideas, the rawest of concepts, the most prime parts of conception of epistemology, ultimately, of what is to be known before you even consider what you might do with that which is known. In the same way that grammar is the basis of writing, of creating coherent and cohesive ideas linguistically. So we see there is a definitively linguistic element to it, as you'll have seen reflected in the writing itself. But let's then ultimately get into that. So we see here, and of course, I am open to suggestions and criticism from anybody who might be watching and listening, and please do offer it where you might. But we see here the opening section. And I will make it clear, again, that this is a work in progress. That's one of the reasons, of course, that it's so terribly open to criticism that can be acted upon and done with for those who might be interested. This is not the final product, by any means, any stretch, and the formatting, the coloration, the fine, minute details, or the particular arrangement of it is not finalized. It's not set in stone. But, looking at it, the panogrammars are recursive, reflexive, and ideal forerunners. Well, what does that all mean? This comes back to our reference to the linguistic, as well as, like you'll see later down the line, the logical and the metaphysical. You might see a thread running through what I was saying here, in addition to those previous. Then, to be recursive, in the linguistic sense, is to be drawing upon yourself, to be calling back to an earlier iteration, a rule, a meaning, order, or fulfillment of that, and composition To be reflexive is to self-identify. That is to say, there is a sense of blank is blank, A equals A. And as you'll see down there, it's a tautology. What that means, again, is that 1 equals 1. Tautology coming from the ancient Greek, meaning to repeat oneself in a coarse translation. That is, for instance, this cup is this cup. That would be what being reflexive ultimately is, in a non-technical, more layman sense. And ideal. If any of you are familiar with the Platonist ideals, or the Platonist ideas rather, of ideal forms, of a world of forms, a realm of forms, where there is a thingness, something that is the ultimate reference, the ultimate abstract object, the holder of a characteristic in the ultimate, absolute, and supreme sense. That everything outside of that is just an imitation of, and therefore imperfect. It does not perfectly take a form. It does not perfectly, for instance, to come back to what I was saying earlier, this cup is just an imperfect representation of a cup. The ultimate cupness. Well, in the metaphysical sense, that would then mean that if there is such a thing as a perfect, an absolute, an entire, and a whole supreme version of anything, these are it. And that they are the forerunners of the entire Panotrivium. As it says there, it's the entirety of all that's drawn. It is then the stuff before stuff, the antecedent, the predecessor, the primogen, the mother or the father, if you would like to think of it in such terms. And what these do, moving past the beginning introductory section, as the protosimogen and the prototaxogen, if you might see a little bit of continuity between me using the term primogen, is that these are the dualities. In an indirect sense, they are parallel, they do not intersect, they are separate, but ultimately exist in the same sort of state as panogrammars. On the protosimogen side, as it says in its introductory paragraph, it is the foremost meaning maker. So to come back to linguistics, as we were talking about earlier, in the cosmological sense, it bestows meaning. It gives meaning. And on the prototaxogen side, the foremost order maker, it gives order, it gives structure, in other words. And as you'll see here, again relevant for anybody who is more familiar with the philosophical concepts underlying them, and you'll probably be able to appreciate all of the fine details of it more specifically. You have, in the protosimogen, potentiality, deductivity, and euaticality. Well, as they have in their own descriptions, they speak for themselves as to what they stand for, but to give a direct explanation, potentiality is essentially where the opportunity lies, where there is an endless amount of things that something can become within its own set, within its own definition, but it is not those things. You might say then that it is the becoming. It is the yet fulfilled, the antecedent, the forerunning the first before the second. Or you might say the zero, as it is something that does exist as a countable thing, but it is not the one. If you think of a sentence per se, or for instance, you might think of the space before the letters begin. That is the proto-simogen. In deductivity, it is the process of taking premises that are known to be universal, that are known to be correct no matter what application in specific or particular, and then taking that over to the side and going, because I know that, I can know this. What that is called is a corollary, ultimately, in a particular sense. And that is to say, if you already have the premises as deductions themselves, if they are already known to be true, if they are, as I say, the things that are known already, then you will know from derivation these things. Now that becomes quite limiting, as you might be able to tell. For the reason that you already have to know things in order to know other things. And you have to know them certainly. You have to know them positively. You have to know them without any doubt. At least within your capabilities and capacity. But that does mean that no matter what, assuming those premises are correct, your conclusions will be correct. And uaticality. Now that is a bit of a neologism on the sort of basis of etymology. Not exactly the same prefix, but it takes the prefix of eu, hyphen, meaning good or true, coming from the Greek. And it appends it to aetion, based on the model of etiology, as it comes to us also from ancient Greek. Well, what is etiology? Well, etiology is the account of causes, the account of starts, in other words. The account of beginnings, or, to wrap it back around, becoming. So you see how this ties into itself. So what then is uaticality looking at it? Well, that would mean that it is the true becoming as a quality or characteristic that can be had. So that gives us a very clear definition, particularly metaphysically, of where origin comes from. And now of the prototaxogen, talking about the true maker of order, as we had it earlier. That is producing, or produced of, it contains and is the unmanifestation of actuality, inductivity, and euonticality. And you'll probably see some dualistic parallels here. So actuality. Well, it is what is there. It is the being, in other words. It is what exists, what is present. It is not the becoming. It is the consequence, the wrapping up into a momentary immediate of potential. Now these then become part of one another. In the indirect sense, they are a not cause and effect, but they are a cause and effect, and what exists as a matter of course in a cause and effect. But in order to have that cause and effect in the first place, you have to have some capacity for it to express, some capacity for it to be instead of become. So that is why I say indirect, in other terms, or in other words. So then you have actuality. That is, once more, what is immediate? Induction, as in inductivity, is something of an inversion or a contravention of deduction. Where deduction is taking your premises that you already have, that you know to be true or believe to be true, and then making corollaries of it, making derivations of it. Induction is taking in all sorts of observations, all sorts of notions, premises, principles, observations, and then creating of those summaries, generalizations, you might think of them as. You don't necessarily know if it is true universally, but you can make a judgment on the particulars. You can make a judgment on what seems to be the course, the flow, the occasion of the action. Thus, induction. And U-onticality, again modeled as you can see not so dissimilar from U-aticality, would then be U, true, good, or right. Ontos, which is the root of the onticality portion. Ontos meaning being, as in existing, or being in that state of immediacy, that tangibility. Icality, meaning a state or condition of, a characteristic, a quality, if you will, that can be had. So, in summary, that would then be true being, a state or condition of true being. And these, as you might be able to see, play directly oppositionally but cooperatively to one another. They exist in a solidaristic bond, a separation, a parallel, but in order for them to be parallel, they have to be relatable to one another in some form or fashion. That is to say, while they may never intersect, while they might not be symmetric, they can ultimately only be in such an orientation if and only if there is some means of relating one to the other. So you have the Panogrammars, and this is why they are twofold. But I might hear you ask, well, you were just talking earlier about dialectics and the fact that it has three parts: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The 1, 2, and 3. Well, where's the 3 in the threefold, then? That's an interesting conclusion that we'll come to in the Panodialectics. Now, the Panodialectics, per the name, like we described earlier, that is the dialectic process, the dialogue, the answer and the question and the answer, and the coming together of these two things. Well, in the notion of the Trivium, the three arts that are part of conversation, a language, in other words, as well as in a more general sense, the grasp of everything, the exchange, the dialogue or discourse that can happen in the context of those things, and then finally the delivery, the expression, the fulfillment of those things in a way that affects. You have these, the semaphoreses, Should probably scroll to keep up with what I'm saying. The syntaxophoresis, and lastly, the semeophoresis. For those of you that do have a bit of a lean into linguistics, you'll probably already glean what exactly these relate to. And if you don't have that, based upon what I was talking about earlier, you might still be able to get it. Exactly what these ultimately tend towards. So, to begin with then, you see that there is the process itself in each of these. You see one for the semantic component, the syntactic component, and the semiotic component. Then you have the ways that those are actually conducted. Excuse me. The ways that those are actually conducted. You have the semaphores, the syntaxophores, scrolling down here, and finally, the semeophores. You have then the constituent elements of the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So the process, and then what carries it. The activity itself, the occasion of a thing, and then what enables the occasion of those things. Apologies, Apologies, I've got a bit of a chest cold, it would seem. But you have all of these coming together, and by the occasion of their existence in relation to one another, not so terribly different from how the proto-simogen and proto-taxogen exist in parallel, and yet do so in relation, in a relationship, you have these three interacting in a triad, a triangular relationship, as opposed to a linear one, you might think. So then, the semaphoresis is the dialectic creator of semantics, of meaning. It's not the foremost. If it were the foremost, as in the proto-simogen, well, then it would have to have no constituents. It would simply have to be. It would have to be ideal, in other words. But it isn't. So then you have three particular parts of such a dialectic process. You have what is ultimately subscript essence, rhizome essence, and quintessence. Well, subscript essence is, in essence, the concept of writing below. It is of where there exists a, again, parallel. You might think of this in the way of, a line on paper, particularly notebook paper. There being the capacity to write in the upper half and write in the bottom half, the lower half. So then you have the capacity to write beneath. You are creating the foundation, in other words, or something akin to it, the footing, the basis. Rhizome essence then comes into the concept of rhizomes, that is, root stalks. These are the parts of specific kinds of plants, you could think like potatoes, but there are many others, where they do not grow in a single portion. They do not grow from a root and then up and out exclusively. They can break off into rhizomes, as they might be called. Tubers, you can think, though not exactly correct. in a botanical sense, but it's a good visual aid. They break off from a whole to form clusters rather than a trunk, a singular base, such that if it is attacked or otherwise interacted with, it's going to affect the entire surrounding body. So that is how that portion of the dialectic works. And then finally we have quintessence. That is thingness, howness, what a thing is in essence, if you will. Now that was something that I didn't touch upon in the Protogrammagen, or the Grammagens, as I talked about earlier. Well, the reason for that is because it is especially relevant here, where essence is something that does proceed, as all things do, back to the Panogrammars. In specific, howness, as it is substantiated in essence, is then the precise and definite set of features that make the definition of a thing. That is to say, that is the essence. And as you can see in the first part of the description of quintessence, it is the intention. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the notion of intention as part of, or an example of a definition, that is to say, all of the stuff that you can say makes a definition in specific. All of the things that a thing that falls under the description will have, no matter what. In the same way as you might have redness, you might have quickness, you might have citrus as a scent. It smells of citrus. All of the characteristics and notions that go into a single concept. That is essence. That is quintessence in specific. Where you might have heard or seen on the banner that I have both on Patreon and the YouTube channel, quiddity, quantity, and quality. That is exactly what this is. Quiddity. And then what does that make itself in the semaphores? Well, that makes sense, reference, and line. Now these might seem a little bit out of place. They might not seem to add entirely up. Well, you see, coming back to what I mentioned earlier about a rhizomescence, the quality of being as a rhizome, well, you need then some means of mapping that intention. You then have sense, semantic sense, particularly, that has its features of being connotative, being consequent, and being effective. You then have your reference, which are then denotative, they are antecedent, and they are causal. Finally, you have your lines that are annotative, they are delineating, and they are eventing. And if you can tell by the way that all of these are arranged and how they relate to the process of the dialectic in and of itself, that these form something of a graph, a network, a web, as you can think of it, if you would want to represent these. So to come over here to our document elsewise, where we can do a little bit of drawing. You know, in fact, I think I'll do it in the painting style. Turn off our text for a second. And come over to Rebel. A very fine program, incidentally. I would highly suggest it. So, let's think about all of these. I gotta choose a good brush first. I think we'll go with acrylics just for the aesthetic element of it. But we see then that you have, well, let's get perhaps a different color, something that is a little bit more pleasing to the eyes. Zoom in a touch. So you have portions all across. And I'll just do, to keep on brand, 3 altogether of the, well, actually, we'll do this a little bit more portrayally. You have 2 portions. So you might have the sense and then you have the reference. And I'll abbreviate that, because I think you'll be able to glean it. But you have no capacity to actually connect these. So what do you need then? You need some point between them. Now, if you were to draw this in a more reality-oriented semantic graph, you might have point over here and point over here. And then you would just draw a straight line between them. But this is not a real-world graph. This is not a direct one-to-one representation of a linguistic semantic network. Instead, we have the line. If I could get that a little bit more precisely. So you can see between the 3 of these, and we'll get back up our text document, and the features that are carried through as the exact principal carriers, the bearers, the fours, the semaphores of the dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or at least in this, the diathesis, which would be to draw across, as you see in our depiction here. You have the basis, the thing that, or rather, you have the connotation, the denotation, and the annotation. You have the sense, the reference, and the point that connects them. You have, in other words, the subscription, the writing beneath. You have the rhizomatic element, or rhizomescence, as it happens to be a part of a greater structure, a greater meaning, the ultimate meaning underneath it. And then you finally have what actually enables those to be connected in the lineans. So, to give a bit more visual aid in a precise method, or more precise depiction, we will take a look at, let's say we want redness. So we'll have as the referent team, and we'll do that there as R, and we'll call that redness. So you have that as the reference. That is the thing that is spoken about whenever you have a sense that is attributed to it. You would then need a line and because this is a very simple denotation, a simple definition, a simple intention, you might only need a single sense, and we'll mark that with an S. So if we wanted an instance of redness, we might say that, assuming we have the quantities of light that is required for redness, because of course you have to remember this is the cosmological model. You don't just start off with things like physics. You don't just start off with everything in order. You get the opportunity to build that, and we'll touch on who exactly that is for later. But for the time being, let's assume that you have this overall connected to under another reference, and we'll just put that down as L. And we will dot that to another R. So you will then have only a few characteristics for what the reference is of a sense. So we'll say that this is light between X and Y wavelength. So you can see this makes, per the description here, a rhizomatic web work, or network, if you will, a semantic dialectic. You have, as what we were describing earlier, the thesis, antithesis, and then in specific, we'll erase these, to this mode of dialectic, the diathesis. And let's come over from the text. There you have that. Now, with that all in one spot, we'll probably move this over a little bit so that we have enough room to show the details of the rest. We have some explanation as to what exactly all of that entails in relation, which is the most important part, per what we were saying earlier, of the syntaxophoresis. So as you can see here, again, not so dissimilar, but opposite and in parallel to the semaphoresis, you have superscriptessence, arborescence, and quintessence. That is, writing above, being like a tree, which is probably a lot more traditional to what people think of when they're thinking of graphs, as linguistics. And finally, quantity. You have the being of at least some. Manyness, you might think of it. Where there is quiddity, that is to say, there is a howness that a thing exists. There must then be some quantity to the thing that is existent. In other words, there must be an instance, something you can point to, that at least exists to have a howness. To make this a little less abstract and more concrete, if you take a look at a phone, let's say there is the quality of the color black that you wanted to have. Well, if we had the quiddity, well, that would be specifically the photonic wavelengths that are reduced but ultimately have enough light reflecting so that you can see visually that there is something that is otherwise absorbing the overwhelming majority of the light. It is dark, in other words, as its predominant coloration. But you had no thing that you could point to and go, this feature, this howness, how that is, exists in a format that I can look at, that I can observe, that I can make an example out of in some form or fashion. Well, then you wouldn't have much at all now, would you? Not insofar as something that could be described or defined. You would not have your intention mean anything. There would be no substance to back up that definition. So you have here the extension. As you can see there, the extensioning. That is to say, a definition that is provided on the basis of how many, in other words, does how this is apply to. So if, for instance, again, I went, this is a stylus, that would be your intention if you gave a list of characteristics that made that stylus a stylus, the howness, the quiddity, and you then went, okay, well, all of the things that fit those criteria are that. that they meet that definition. They hit that threshold. That would be your extension. And that is reflected in the syntaxophores. Again, the things that carry out a dialectic. The thesis, antithesis, and in this case, the thing that allows them to go between. The diathesis. The carrier of carrying on. So here we see then the existemes, the universemes, and the nodiemes, like I was saying earlier, and you'll be able to see right here in the quintessence portion, as well as in the the arborescence portion. You have what carries out the connotation, the leaf portion of a hierarchy, of a graph that is built as a tree, a parse, if you will, and I'll demonstrate that here in a few moments. And existence. You then have the universemes that carry out the denotations. They give you the roots of trees. And finally you have the universality, as it exists in contrast to existentiality. And in the nodiemes, you have then annotations, nodalization, that is to say, making like nodes. And finally, you have your setization, that is to say, what makes sets, the making of sets. And let's have some visual depiction for that. So, you see over here, and that did dry terribly. I think I'm going to switch to a different brush. Oh, that's much more smooth. So we are looking at these over here. Those portions right above and to the left of me. That is a network. And we can show that a little bit differently. By, let's say, a very simple interconnection. And we'll do these at random, not to mean anything. But you can see there, they can connect in any which way, and ultimately form whatever they will. As there might be here, since it's the central point, the reference, and all of these could be senses connected by lines. On the opposite side, you have trees, and we will represent those like so. Now, this will be in an opposite direction to what some people think of, because these are, as I say, parse trees. So let us do an existeme, and then we will have your... Sorry, that would be a universeme. And then you have your existemes. And then not so different. Let's draw those a little bit bigger. And then not so different from the function of linemes. You have your nodiemes. And we will represent these as ins. We'll draw that out over here. have that as so. The universe seems abbreviated. And then we will have the existings. Oop. You know, I'll tell you. I am more used to, ultimately, traditional media rather than digital, and I think it shows. So, you have these offering to give a syntactic quantity. Let me buttress that real quick. A syntactic quantity to a howness, as we see expressed over here. Which I think the fact that that is so much more coarse as it has absorbed into the canvas compared, more fuzzy, in other words, compared to the rigor of syntax, is a little bit indicative and therefore humorous by extent. So let's move that. Move that. Ah, interesting. Doesn't seem to want to take. There we go. And deselect. So you have what can give a quantity to all of these. So let's say, continuing with the example of redness earlier, you have something that you want to express. And now keep in mind, at this point, they do not interact. But just in isolation, we would have, let's go with, abstract variables. We'll go with, there exists, or there is universally, X. And we want of that universality there to exist a whole or a subset. We'll do Y. Should probably leave room for an L now, shouldn't I? Or an N. So we'll have the node there that either gives it a being or not being. So we'll have that. And this is similar to X-bar theory for those of you who do actually study syntax. There will then be Y subset, and under that we will have, or you know what, in comparison to them, we will have in, and then we will have Z subset over here. But under Y subset, we'll have another set of subsets. And these will be A and B. So you can see here, assigning the notation for them as there universally exists X, and of X there is subset Y, and under subset Y there are subsets. Let me actually make that look a little presentable. There also exists subsets A and subset B. There also exists universally under X as a set, subset Z, and it does not have any connection to the whole portion or the whole subset of Y nor A and B in any way. That is to say, where there universally exists this set, there are two first level subsets, and under Y, the first level subset, there is two second level subsets of A and B. But as these stand, as per syntax, where semantics are a little bit more intuitive, I think, to grasp, as under syntax, there is not any assignment of meaning. That is why this is separate, as you'll see if I'll pull back up the text, as you'll see, between the descriptors offered in the course of the dialectic. Let's see. Yes, the ordering bearers, the process of ordering bearers, versus the semaphoresis, which is the process of meaning bearers. That is where these semantic webs have all of the quiddity, the howness, and none of the manyness. These have all of the manyness, but none of the howness. And if you've been picking up on what this means cosmologically, that is to say, by how the existence, that is, of course, not in the specific meaning of syntax as it is presented here. Where there is all of the cosmos, we'll say more generally, where there is all of the cosmos that exists with the parallel of becoming and being, but no intersection, these otherwise do not touch, these otherwise do not interact, they do not interface as they stand alone. They only move around and manipulate one another. So, what does that mean for the cosmos as it is? Well, it's an incomplete, therefore, dialectic composed of three different processes: the phoreses, the dialectophoreses, or dialectices, I mean to say. And there is no synthesis. Well, that would be very, very troublesome if we did not have the semiophoresis. If we did not have something that provides transcriptessence, cartogrammessence, and qualessence. That is to say, if we didn't have something that could take the things that are writing below and writing above and write across them. Now you might see where I was referring to the parallels earlier. If you didn't have something that can take meaning and order and map these upon one another. You couldn't have something that made them interact in any way as to give, coming into the qualescence, quality, the whatness of a thing, the thing that makes what kinds, the thing that takes quiddity and quantity and enables them to exist simultaneously. As you'll see, and you might be reading, if I were to scroll down just a touch, there would be nothing that could give you a superposition, a state that exists between these. But there is. And if we refer back to, as I pull this down and come back over to, let's just take a look at that. Oop. Try that again. You know what? Better yet, I'll just draw it instead. If we didn't have, and I really should have drawn this out earlier, but do forgive us, this is the first time we've tried this format. While we have gotten a little bit better at the books and the gaming, first time for a little bit of illustration, we have existing as in the logo, and I'll probably actually do this down here, since that other portion will be reserved, I think, for the semiophoresis. We have, thus far, I'll try and give myself enough room here to where I don't run out. And a line going down the middle. So we have the, we'll go with P to represent the prototaxogens. And then we will go with the D for the dialectophoresis. Now this exists as a bridge across. In that case, we'll actually give it something a little bit better. We'll call that, in the parallel here, the semiphoresis and the syntaxophoresis. But we then have down here the This is very ad hoc, although the ideas are not. We'll do us up a S meaning and order, then to be joined together at the very center, but we'll talk about that in just a few moments, followed by and brought down through the sign process. And then filled out, as we'll see later, by some additional portions. But we'll draw those as we come to it. So we can see here that we have the representation in the actual logo, the brand as it stands, of the prototaxogens and the protosimogen coming together to represent directly the meaning and order as dialectics. Those are then joined later down the line by what I'll put down here is a representative one, but we'll express that later. And that is then made thoroughly possible. This bridge between these parallels is made thoroughly, well, I'll probably trade those out now that I think about it. Made thoroughly possible by the sign. And we then come to what exactly progresses, like we described earlier, a dialectic supposes, even if not explicitly, implicitly, the notion of progress. What those will progress into. But let's wrap up with the description of the semiophoresis first. In this, you then have the allodynamics, the alloenergics, and the allomonads. Starting with the allodynamics, these give us interconnotation. Alongside that, propositions. And finally, we have dynamics. And these are in process, abduction, and eucosmos. So to break that down, that is, as you might have heard before, with the other ones, you see that there is a continuity running through these. Connotation. The thing between those is made in and of the allodynamics, alongside proposition. That is a zeroth order logic. That is a, for instance, basic premise without anything that quantifies, anything that gives it a notion of this exists in so many numbers, or this exists among so many numbers. There is no existential or universal component to it. That is to say. And finally, dynamic. Well, that calls back to the concept of potential. The concept of, as you'll be able to see it here, matter. The concept of the raw howness of a thing. As it is made existing. The basic particular of a universal, an instance, in other words. Something that exists, that is, has a manyness, and also is a how. A howness. It has a howness. To look at another example, coming back to, we'll say, my little desk trifle here. Little frog friend. This would be an example if it were just a single body, a simple body. It is a unibody. It has no separate smaller pieces, as it is here in my fingers. This is not a basic characteristic of frog, but it has metalness. It has the quality of being aluminum. There is no smaller component to it, let's say. Since, as you might recall, you need something to call back to further down the line. Let's pull that up. You need something to refer to further back the line before you get to the notion of things like atoms and quarks and subatomic particles. You have a semantic tree that it relies upon, or a semantic network that it relies further back upon. But let's assume that those are pre-established. The concept of aluminum, as it is defined with the Hownes. This could then be a dynamic. That is to say, a matter. It has an origin, a Hownes, identified in a particular, a manyness. Now that, of course, is in more concrete terms, but you can envision, perhaps, what that would mean for the cosmos. If you were to say, here is, assuming there is a universal back there, and a reference back there, that ultimately enables such a thing to exist if it is not a standalone Hownes and manyness, if it is not a standalone essence and construct, then you can have anything ranging from a magical effect to, for instance, like those subatomic particles, or even something that exists without atoms, that takes the form of a solid, a liquid, a gas, a force, a motion, anything. A Hownes and a quantity, that's all that it is. In particular, as an origin, an agency, what it can do, what it will do given the opportunity, an externalizing factor, and a part. Something that can have that to happen out of. You have then the internal and the external. We then look at alloenergics. These have interdenotation, predicates, and, ultimately, energy. So when we look at that, in contrast to the allodynamics, we have what is an interdenotation, and I think that that's rather self-explanatory. An existence between denotations, a hard expression of a thing, a full expression of a thing. You then have predicates in contrast to propositions, which are, of course, partially composed of propositions, in that there are premises, but these particular predicates are quantifying. They are making universal or existential. In this case, it does the universal portion. It is something that gives us an expression of what all of a thing will have. Universally, where there is the sense, you have a connotation, a thing that can be said of a reference. You then also have in the sense of an existence, something that can be shared across those existences. So when you bring these together, and you make something universal out of a reference, a ultimate Hownes of an ultimate manyness, you then have the notion here of a predicate that gives you in its eucosmicality, its expression, which I just noticed that I had not corrected that over. Whenever I pause to clear my throat, it moved it back up. Yes, whenever you look at it eucosmically, you have energy. You have something that exists in a more ideal state than a given example. So, as an explanation, we might say there is, in the allodynamic side, the matter contained in our frog friend here that expresses metalness, being of aluminum, aluminality, you might think. But if we were to then extract that or extrapolate that, you then have the entire idea of aluminum not just as it is put into a given thing like this little trinket here, but as it might exist as an ethereal, a formal conception, not just the individual shows of a notion, but the notion in its prime form. So an example of this might be where you have that example of a matter. You have something that is a solid, a liquid, a gas, a magical effect, a fulfillment of becoming. You have a fulfillment of being. You would have something that can be drawn upon to enable the expression of any of those things. An actual basis for you to call upon. You might think of this in metaphor as having something that is casted from a mold versus something that is the mold itself. You might have the source of light like a lamp and then the light itself. You would have, again, the dynamic that springs forth from an energy. You have the interior of matter and the exterior of energy. You have the immanence and the immanence, the ingress and the egress, the flowing inward that is dynamic and the flowing outward that is energic. You have then the matter here and the form that ultimately is necessary for the matter to exist at all in a given presence. And finally we have the allomonads, which interpose or superpose. They bring together all of these things as interannotation, a objectification, and a superposition. This is what they do. They take the matter predominated dynamic and the form denominated or predominated energy. That is, again, the thing that is made and the thing that makes. The combination of an individual howness and a plural, a collective howness. And it takes these and makes them together. Now, what I was mentioning earlier, or in the vein of what I was mentioning earlier, that can, you might glean, grant an awful lot of power, an awful lot of strength to whatever is made up by these things. an awful lot of opportunity for the collection of both proposition and predicate, of howness and manyness, in a whatness that overrides the entire rest of them, that then makes it the ultimate thing that can bridge between the dialectices, the semantics and the syntax, the meaning and the order, in something that is ultimately at a higher level than these. The sign, the signification, the ultimate arbiter of those things. And so it is. Then we come back to our illustration here earlier, back up to the upper right, to give a little bit of a show of what these maps would then look like. So we have our network here. We'll have a depiction of it. We'll do a little 3x3 to represent our semantic web, our semantic rhizome. If I could draw a straight line to save my life. And then, to the opposite side, we'll have, again, if I could draw a straight line, a tree like we had before. And we'll copy these to make it convenient for the three illustrations that will constitute these. And we'll do 3 layers, or 3 levels, if you will. And what the semiophores do is then, in terms of the... Let's actually copy this. We'll move this... Well, I guess not. We will select copy. And then, if I could remember to actually hit the button, move it. Move that to one side, that to the other. If you are unfamiliar with Rebel, it has this great feature that saves you a lot of trouble, where it will copy any transformations of the canvas to another layer, but man, is that somewhat inconvenient for haste. So we will have on one side the representation here of our senses that are all coming together into the reference. We will have our universals that are all part of or made underneath it, part of the existentials. And with that, we of course have our nodes that create our lines here, or that create our connections here. And we have our lines that create our connections over here. So, downscaling these. Bring that over to the side for the demonstrative example. If I could remember to be on the right layer at the same time. Hopefully we got it now. Yeah. We'll have that over there. We have the allodynamics, which, as you might have recalled, take the portions on the outside over here of a semantic web. So it will take all of these if I could get that properly. Yes. We'll take all of these portions here. And all of these portions here. And it will take them and create out of them a proposition. Make that a little bit drawn together. Actually, let's do that a little bit more appropriately in line with the rest of them. You know what? Because they would end up being the same, we'll just shorthand that to dynamic. And we will copy, or rather, take an instance of these, copy and paste. Size them down a good bit to approximately the same. And we will sculpt up what these alloenergics take. They take a much more simple possession of the references and the universals. And they give us if we could get something approximating a decent shape. The energics. Finally, we'll probably reverse these so that it's more clear in line with the order that they're presented. finally, and this is the most easy to convey overall, if I'll remember to move those down properly, size these as well. You have the most easy, taking your entire semantic webs, the totality of your syntactic trees, and the ability to take your dynamics and your energics and put them all together into your... Well, that doesn't leave much room for the actual text now, does it? But I don't suppose that's a problem. Your monads. So as you can see here, these have a tremendous amount of potential in the non-metaphysical sense. A huge, in the metaphysical sense, ability to offer what you might call a superposition, a flux of dynamic and energy. That is the ability to take not only the specific individuals, but also the overall collectives of all of these notions of dynamics and energies and subordinate it upon its own set of semantics and syntaxes or syntactics. So that all of the stuff beneath it necessarily must comply with it. Necessarily must not contradict or counteract it. And in fact, let's do us a little bit better of a representation. We will remove these arms and further clarify. Means that our little sidelong text there is perhaps not the most necessary any longer, but we'll do us a little bit of an example. While of course it could serve in such a fashion as to be referenced or otherwise called back upon, we can also subordinate things underneath them. So we have a one-way representation. And not only does it offer the downward slope, or rather the downstream of all of those nice little semantics and syntactics, but it confines them. It parenthesizes them. It gives them, if you will, stops as to where and how they develop. They must be part of this. So, for those of you who might have been thinking about this in terms of the mechanical aspect, beyond just the diagrams, beyond just the visual representations of what they do, and what those little parts that make it up all do in their own time, you might think, well, this would be a great way to have ultimate authority over your lower forms of, or derivatives of these things. You can have a monad dominating and commanding your dynamics and energies. So in other words, you could have a whatness that is made up of its own howness and mininess determine lower hownesses and mininesses, which ultimately come together to make up the thisnesses, the kinds, in other words. This would mean that while you can have, if you were not under the confines of a monad, some amount of dynamic or energy that is free, some amount of existence and sense and reference and universal that can be outside of these things. They won't necessarily be particularly meaningful by any means. They have nothing ultimately to root themselves in that is whole, a total interaction between the semaphoresis and the syntaxophoresis. So they would essentially be ineffectual outside of their own internalities and externalities, their own emanations and emanations, their own ingresses and egresses. And that's exactly right. But you can have a congress that ultimately can allow the hosting of all kinds of these. You can have, in other words, in, more player-oriented or even game master-oriented terms, you can have a universe that is defined in its meaning and order underneath of ultimately a higher order, a higher meaning. And inside of that higher level, directly beneath it, you can have the command and control of smaller ones. You can have lower or lesser meanings and orders. And you can have those operate together in a stepped fashion, where the dynamics are more reliant on the energics in totality. Making this even more concrete, as a specific example, you can have the equivalent of a little, to borrow on Forgotten Realms terms, like a sphere, a celestial sphere, a realm, a sort of a sort of bounding box, or bounding, well, globe, that holds inside of it all of the little things, all of the little cosmos, the little orders, the little meanings. So you could have, for instance, something like little demiplanes that are inside of an equivalent of a mage, someone who works with dynamics. Or you could have something that is extenuating, like a proper full plane, something that stretches out over an area, something that can be traversed into and expands the interior capacity of a celestial sphere. In maybe not a Euclidean sense, maybe not a geometric sense in that fashion that it has a direct continuity with the main realm, the main space-time continuity, but a little side area. That is to say, it accounts for not just pocket dimensions, but it accounts for full over or underlaying dimensions that are only accessible through, to borrow on some additional fiction, like for instance, or for an example, the Lion, the Witch, and the wardrobe itself, or maybe a magical gate of some description, a fairy ring that you have to pass through or do a particular ritual to get through. You have to have the meaning and the order to actually make happen. You have to have the proposition or the premise, or not premise, but predicate, to actually access or interact with these kinds of, again, pocket or planar realms in the confines of an overarching realm, a celestial sphere, a whole that contains all of these portions, a universe in the non-technical, non-logical sense. A total cosmos. And moreover than that, because these are not just unique little one-off entities like you might have in a magical item or some kind of weave, some kind of godhead, some kind of power that can only be possessed by a single individual or small handful through some mystical means. You can have multiple of those spheres going concurrently at entirely different rates, at entirely different levels of access, at completely different ways of being from the ground up. They can have entirely different meanings and orders. That is to say, semantics and syntaxes. And in the semiotic context, they can form the content and the expression, that which lies underneath and that which lies as an expression of what is above, a subscript or a subscription and a superscription, all brought together by transcription. You have the ability to then host any, and I mean any, kind of, again, non-logical existence in the threefold manifold. And if you wanted to be a complete and total stickler about it, you could very reasonably list out all of the meanings and all of the order. You could give all of the depth and all of the surface, all of the semantics and all of the syntaxes for every little thing that exists in a sphere, a cosmos, a celestial body, a collection of a bounded workspace for whatever you wanted. That could be pre-existing fiction. That could be a model of our universe as it exists. That could be a whole homebrew. Naturally, it can contain all of the provided settings that we will give, but it enables a universally... Let me back off of that term because it does have special meaning here. It gives you the ability to have a metaphysically true, constant, consistent realm in any flavor you might desire it. It is the ultimate tool for making something that is inarguable. Making something that is narratively perfectly internally consistent. But then, while we have touched on it briefly, while we have our Panogrammars here, and now we have expressed the extent of our Panodialectics here, we need to talk about our third part. And these would be, as we'll put down, the Panorhetorics. So we have first the invention, Cosmo invention, well, let me back that up. We have the Cosmo style, which ultimately performs a role similar to the monad. We have the Cosmo invention, and finally we have the Cosmo arrangement. And if you've been following along so far, you'll probably be able to guess what these relate to. And now that we have those put into place, if you have noticed that there seems to be 8 individual spots rolling around the, or rather circling around the phi-like shape of the threefold manifold branding, you have at the corners or at the radial positions, and these go in no particular order, but we'll start from the top here with the dialectophores. So we start with the senseme, we'll close that off with an E, since that's what the word ends on. The referentium, the lineeme, the existeme, the universime, the, what am I looking for here? Nodine, and then finally, of the semiophores, we have the allodynamics and the alloenergics. And you might have noticed, hey, you know, you're missing the monadine, or the allomonad. And you would be right, ultimately. If not for the fact that the whole circle of the thing effectively encompasses the allomonad. So in a clever little bit, or at least I think it's clever, of circumvention, we have, or not circumvention, but circumvallation, we have the whole thing. Now this is of course purely representative, and that's why I've drawn it outwardly from it, almost like parentheses. The allomonad. And you can imagine that being the whole circle of the thing, because it is capable of encompassing the entirety of it. That is the point, that is the reason, the rationale for the circular shape, ultimately. But having made that little description, let us clean up our place, our drawing table, and then we will move on to the Panorhetorics. So, closing down that, and coming back to our document proper, touching on rhetorics. I think we've described a little bit of it already, but we'll give it a proper once over here, where your grammar is, again, your bases, the things that you are looking to use in its basics. Your dialectics are what are able to be interacted between those things and carry forward into some sort of resolution. Your rhetorics are ultimately the delivery of that resolution, the persuasion of a synthesis in its totality. The giving forward beyond just the content that is able to be accounted for in your grammar, the surface that exists in your dialectic. It gives you the culmination in a not so dissimilar fashion to the way that the semiophoresis gives you that transcript essence, that writing across, that bringing together, that final synthesis. So when you have that in the context of the cosmology, you have our Panorhetorics. And these come in the form of and these are the ones I've been working on the most recently, and you might be able to tell that, the Cosmo Inventions, the Cosmo Arrangements, and the Cosmo Styles. Now these are inspired, these names, by the 5 canons, you might note, of rhetoric. And those are, in English, although these are presented to us, as far as I know, historically, in its original form by Cicero, an long gone Roman senator. With a lot more accolades you could pile onto him, whether you like him or not, but that's for a different discussion entirely. But they are, as you can see here, invention, arrangement, memory, and delivery. Well, since this is an extrapolation, a sort of a generalization of these notions already, and we can see in the forerunning parts, and I think ultimately this does hold true even in its technical and specific senses, you need, since we only cover the 3 here, up to styles. which I think I did skip over. That's invention, arrangement, style, memory, and finally delivery. In order to have anything beyond these three, invention, arrangement, and style, in the form of memory and delivery, where memory I think is covered most clearly by your grammar. Well, if you don't remember your grammar, you don't have the grammar. And if your delivery is not covered by your dialectic, your conveyance, your dialogue, your discourse on a given thing constructed from your grammars, well, I don't think you have much of any rhetoric at all. But then assuming that these are already fulfilled by the preceding, do you need? Well, you need invention, arrangement, and style. Your deliveries need these things. In other words, I should probably stop repeating that phrase. To put it a different way, you have invention, where you are actually making something of a thing. You are actually culminating and again, this is in the generalized, non-specific context of, like, public orating rhetoric, but in the cosmological sense, you need to be able to bring together that howness with that quantity, that howness with that manyness. You then need some way to put that together. You have your arrangements. You have your bringing together of the howness and the manyness into a form, a morphology, a shape that constitutes a count, a quantity ultimately. And then finally you have your style. Well, if you just had something that is invented and something that is arranged, then you have absolutely no grounding, no footing, no surroundings with which to orient yourself. You would have no style. If you don't have any style, then how are you intended to deliver it all? How are you intended to have a rhetorical expression? It would just be a relaying of all of that underlying meaning and order. There would be no signification. There would be no making of signs. There would be no actual conveyance in a meaningful way, in a way that was a full delivery of the thing. So then we must look at what these are all arranged of, and what these actually represent. So as I said, these are Panorhetorics. These are Cosmorhetorics individually, as you might call them, in the same way as Cosmogens from the Panogrammars and Dialectices from the Panodialectics. These would then be the Cosmorhetors. They are the speakers in a cosmic context. They are the governors that are of speech. They present the speech of governance, as we would experience all of the things that lie underneath. To convey that a little bit more concretely, like with the dialectics and what they represent, if we look at this phone charger, or this USB charger, if I were to have between my fingers, and in fact my fingers in and of themselves being so, if I were to have interacted with the substance, which is what the dialectics are concerned with generating and maneuvering, allowing to move through not space and time, but being and becoming. If I were to be interacting with the underlying substance underneath, then I, as a conscious being, would be putting, in real life terms, directly, atom to atom, quark to quark, part to part, in its entirety. There would be no such thing as an air gap that exists on the microscopic level. I would be physically, my epidermis would be participating with the atomic structures of this charger. But it ain't. Simply put, it isn't. So then, what instead we're looking at is the interfacing of accidents. That's a metaphysical and philosophical concept there, in particular. Now, the accidents of such a thing are to look at some of the hownesses, to look at some of the quiddities. It has the various parts, or the various compounds that they are. You have the steel prongs, you have the internal components as they are, you have the quiddities that those all have, the hownesses of what makes them so. And you have features like being the color black on the outside and silvery on the prongs, white on the little connector. And then you have the mininesses. You have all of the individual atoms, or the quarks, the subatomic particles, that come together to make the atoms, that come together to make the solids that I'm ultimately holding in my fingers, the accidents. Not the substances, just the accidents, the things that come after those. Now, naturally, if you just had these separately, they wouldn't do much, but having them together, you can have all of these parts, all of these individual things beyond the substances. My atoms, my subatomic particles, and whatever is beneath them, if there is anything physically speaking, or it's just pure energy, isn't directly interacting with the pure energy of this charger. The accidents are interacting with one another. That is the exchange, physically speaking, that is occurring. So then when we look at the Panorhetorics, you'll see that for the practical, for the normal, from a, human perspective, for the conscious creature, these are the things that matter the most. Where I was talking earlier about the sort of, and I'll pull this up here, the fact that you can have these whole sorts or kinds of existences that happen to be out there, whether they are anchored in a monadic shell, whether they are given an ultimate superposition of dynamic and energy, whether they are separate and apart, and they do not interface in that way, or they do exist under the confines of that monad, then you have the ability for all of those different realms, all those different dimensions, all those different planes. These are the more touchable stuff, the palpable stuff, the things that you can interface with. That is why the names of, for instance, dynamic and energy, aside from philosophical bases in Aristotelian realism, are so, because you have all of the accidents, as I was just talking about. You then have the inventions, which are directly linked to the allodynamics, the arrangements that are directly linked to the alloenergics, and finally, the styles that are directly linked to the allomonads. You have, again, the fulfillment in individual instance. The accidents that are invented. They are spawned, they are made, they are not just existing in semantics, syntax, and semiotics. They are present aside from the substances. You then have the arrangements, which are the universal things that ultimately allow those inventions to be. You have the blackness of black, the steelness of steel, the componentness of components, the parts of parts, or the parthood of parts, that ultimately compose, again, this charger. And in the totality of these things, you have what allows them to have an interaction between those, to have an interface between your existentials and your universals, your senses and your references, your things that are cast and the molds that allow them to be cast. You have the ability for a charger to be a charger and for other chargers to also exist in the same confines, the same domain as others. The ability to instance not just as a sense, as an individual or a collective, but as individuals that have collectives that have individuals. Parts and wholes that can exist simultaneously and in direct, instead of indirect parallel, intersecting relation with one another. And that is what these amount to. So, if we were to pull back up our relays here, we could have, or our visual relays here, we could have, let's say, we are running out of space on this page, although I think we could probably condense that a bit. In fact, I will, since I'm done drawing that out, move that up and over. Deselect. Reselect. And probably reselect again after I move that over. Blur. There we go. Gotta move that out of the way so I can get more up to it. Oh. Layers. Every time. But when they come in handy, they certainly come in handy. Alright, plenty more room. So, coming back to it, we have an example, let's put this together, of these, which are the ultimate pinnacle that enables such a thing as the following. Shrink those down because we don't need their exact depictions. And we'll space those out a little bit. Erase a little. And now you can perhaps see why. In the introduction video, all of these drawings were sped up a great deal. Lost a little bit there. We'll need that probably further down, in fact, or maybe over closer to the side. I think that'll do. Well, let's actually go back to making that more middlesome. So, now that we finally have the space for it, and the parts made out, we will have, coming from a dynamic, or an allodynamic, an alloenergic, and a allomonad, multiple. I could probably draw those a little bit further down. No, that would be appropriate. Cool. Alright, so we would have then our Cosmo-redders. Our Cosmo arrangements, or our Cosmo inventions, I mean to say. Our Cosmo arrangements. And finally, our Cosmo styles, which entail Cosmo inventions and Cosmo arrangements. And those can subordinate further Cosmo inventions and Cosmo arrangements. And these make up the accidents that's going to be a tricky one, the Cosmo style up there. These are going to make up your quantitative, and I'm going to shorthand that to quid. Accidents. That would be your quantitative, shorthanded quant. accidents. We're going to shorthand that over here to quid A. Let's not bunch those entirely together. And quant A. And then we come up and have qual A. Which is, in fact, constituted of... erasing a little bit of our monad there. We can get a better angle on that. Our quid A and our quant A. So, now that we finally have all of that drawn out, what this means is that these are directly equivalent, but not equal. And in fact, we can better represent that by doing a little something like this. To borrow a little bit of symbolic logic, these are that's not appropriate. Entirely different color there. Guess we'll have to leave that little part there. And these are, in fact, equal. So, you can see here, we have allodynamics equivalent to cosmo-inventions, which are equal to quantitative accidents. We then have our alloenergics, which are equal to our cosmo-arrangements, which are equivalent to our cosmo-arrangements, which are equal to our quantitative accidents. We then have allomonads, which are equivalent with our cosmos styles, and those cosmos styles are equal to our qualitative accidents. Now, beneath composing such a thing, you need the the allodynamic, which is subordinated under the monad directly as equivalent to the quantitative accidents. And finally, the alloenergics equivalent to the quantitative accidents. And those can go on, per what we were talking about earlier, with the equivalations and equalities of the individual instances. So, to directly loop back into what I was talking with earlier about the intangibles, the abstracts, the realms, dimensions, the planes, and all of that. Now, instead of being just big empty boxes, with the Panorhetorics, you can take all of those disconnected and notional, dialectic parts that are interacted together, ultimately by the semiophoresis and the semiophores, and have something made of them. You can fill those boxes. So if we are to come back over here and take a look at our graph, and I will, in fact, at this point, pull up the original, or our threefold manifold brand and avatar. So if we take a look at this, you can see here, as I zoom in, that we have the arms coming off, and I'll close that since it's no longer needed. We have the arms coming off to join in, if I'll have the rebel pulled up at the same time. The arms coming off to join in from the panogrammars that are ultimately joined in a bilateral, non-uniform, or that is to say non-symmetric orientation that enables the panodialectics of the semiophoresis and the syntaxophoresis that is then ultimately joined into our Panorhetorics by, at the midpoint there, that joining binding point, by the semiophoresis. And all of those panodialectics, those dialectices, have dialectophores, which are represented in the synseme, the referenceme, the lineme, the existeme, the universeme, the nodeme, the allodynamics, and the alloenergics, to ultimately come together in the allomonad, as represented in the circle, as such, that then finally comes down into our Panorhetorics as we know them, where that is the Cosmos style that allows the Cosmo inventions and Cosmo arrangements to fork out. And yet they are not entirely reliant upon one another. I apologize, my throat is getting rather sore. But we have it. The entirety of a cosmological system what enables the full flex, the full frame of what an individual might want to bring to the table. If it can be justified consistently, if it is able to have its own internal logic, that it follows by design and default, then you can have anything in the Threefold Manifold, whether it is importing your own, though I of course can't do it for copyright reasons, whether it's importing your favorite superhero universe, Marvel or DC or an alternative, whether it is trying to roleplay out the specific mechanics, the specific game rules, and the cosmology of Call of Cthulhu, whether it is wanting to bring in characters from Eberron, or the Forgotten Realms, or Greyhawk, whether it is wanting to make possible and real some crazy wild nonsense from anime or mangas, whatever you might want, whatever can be justified linguistically, logically, and metaphysically, you can have happen. And it can be a legitimate extension and expansion of the lore, of the cosmology, of the realms that exist in any given setting. And with that, in a similar fashion to giving the source code, the whole stuff of an engine, a game engine, you gain the total access of the freedom of expression as a player under the Threefold Manifold. You can have any character, any object, any item, so long as it is accessible under a given realm, domain, or universe. However you might want to look at it or phrase it. That can range from something like something very unlikely, like the Book of Vile Darkness from D&D, to something a little bit more reasonably achievable because it follows, of course, truncated and modified sci-fi physics, like a ring from Halo, to characters like maybe you want to bring Jack and Daxter in from Naughty Dog fame of the PS2. You can, feasibly. You can make sure that it lines up with everything. You can have whatever you want, your cake, and you can eat it too, as long as you're willing to bake the cake. So now that we've gone over a very brief overview, and I have left a lot I could talk about on the table because I don't want to sit here and, PowerPoint at you, such that we're just, I'm telling you the text, I'm reading you all the text that's on screen. Although that will be done once the material is ready for publishing. I'll do an audio version of all of that for anybody who might be vision impaired or just prefer that format earnestly. Although it will be interesting for game rules. We then come over to who is this for? Well, simply, who this is for is any kind of game master. I don't have a specific name set for what I'll call the equivalent in the Threefold Manifold, but you can imagine it'll be something probably in the lines of what you're reading here, because that is the kind of literary style that I'll be going for. But who these mechanics are for generally at the lowest level of actually doing like semantic webs and syntactic parse trees and semiotic maps of the two. Ultra nerds who really, really, really want to make sure that they can get whatever they want in a game on the player side. But more likely, it's going to be for people who want to ensure that they have full command and control over their own realm. They don't have to call upon any preceding game. They don't have to call upon any preceding lore. They don't have to import something that ultimately doesn't mesh or line up. Maybe they want even a modified version of an existing setting, and they want to make it sure that it works properly, that there's no giant plot holes or parts of their microcosmology that have issues. But that can very easily be done in this way, in a unified and, unilateral system, as long as there's no competition. And beyond that, for those who might want to expand their own systems upon the game, whether that is on the top level, the surface, like we experience with, maybe I want to be able to, by a set of rules, do nation management, or I want to run a restaurant, or I want to have a fishing minigame mechanic for my tabletop. Well, if you want anything more deep than that, for instance, why can this force field act like a force field? Why can this fireball do fireball things? Why can this demiplane act like a demiplane? Now you have a cause to examine these things, and it's not as if you necessarily need to go all in on doing the microsyntax and microsemantics and microsemiotics. No. You can very easily, in common language, go, okay, I have so-and-so measure of this meaning, and I have so-and-so measure of this order, and I may or may not have my own independent amount of signs that I can make these things work between. And I can know calculably with basic language, whether it's English or what you have to bring for your own, calculating those numbers from what words you use, what terms you use, what phrases are input, the exact reasonable effect that you can expect, or something that has no precedence and you're wanting to do freeform. Or you can just say, alright, I will have this amount of meaning and this amount of order in perfect equality, and I'll measure how much I need to execute a spell, a magical move, an ability, or playing around with like space and time, how much it will take to affect a change. Your game master can go, it is reasonable with what you have written out here or spoken that these words cost this much, and because of that, you will have to expend so-and-so in order to keep this effect going. And it will be that effect will occupy that much of your signification. Or the amount of time that it's going. So this has applications for everybody who does not want to just play a magic-free and derivative kind of gameplay, although that will be provided for. Maybe you want to do free-form magic types of things, you want to do reality building, world making kind of stuff. That is who these are for. And that is ultimately the end of my presentation. Frantic, hectic, as it is my very first time ever doing it, in the midst of just having finally gotten it to a point where I think that it is presentable and it's something that I can show for those of you who would want to have stopped and read what there is to read, to see what there is to see, to experience what there is to experience out of what is happening in the Threefold Manifold so far. With that then, I thank you all for watching. I plead for anybody who finds any of these ideas, whether they're illustrated, written, or spoken here today, to share the video more than anything. You can like and subscribe if you want to get more content such as this, but most importantly, if you want to make sure that I can keep doing this for as long as possible and hopefully eventually enable it as my primary career, then please do share it. If you want to help get to the ground floor of making a community that cares about these sorts of things, that wants for mechanics to be good, that wants for mechanics to be scalable and approachable from however you might want, that enable you to do the maximal stuff possible at whatever level of complexity that you are most comfortable with it, please come join our Discord. If you don't want to engage with me by Discord, you can also find me on X if you want to reach out directly. And otherwise, if you want to maybe per se just listen to the content or have it available on a platform that's more of your liking, we are also on Spotify. If you want to do more than that, if you think this might be worth a little bit of change from you to me, that will support ultimately all of these goals and more monetarily, you can check out our Patreon if you want something that is more of a one-time thing and doesn't have a locked scale of tiers. You can always tip me on Streamelements. That's always appreciated. But if you want that subscription, the lowest tier is Proponent. You get that for $5 a month. That gets you all paid content that is exclusive to patrons only, ad-free recordings of not only the whole streams but the shorts, ad-free credits here at the end, where there is no showing of sponsorships or in-roll ads, and ultimately a vote on all channel polls that are issued forth. Whether I need to hear something from you guys on your opinion, or there's a direction that I'm not sure how I might want to proceed forward with on the Threefold Manifold game. And all of the higher tiers carry all of the benefits of that and better, as you look towards the $10 Exponent and $20 Ultraponent tiers for those who absolutely love what we're trying to accomplish here. With that all having been said, this is the dawning of a Trivium, and I have been Kairos. Never miss your opportunities.